In this video, we're going to look at how to use Gun.js to build a peer-to-peer network. And in our case, we're going to be building a real-time, offline-first, peer-to-peer messaging application. Now, and we're going to be using Gun.js along with React. Now, what is Gun? Gun is a fully decentralized peer-to-peer networking library that allows you to build peer-to-peer networks. And in these types of applications, changes in data are not controlled by any central server, because a server can essentially be any connected peer or connected browser within the network. You save data to one machine and it syncs to all the other peers without needing any type of complex consensus protocol, because the Gun library actually handles all of that for you. When a browser peer asks for data, it'll merge the reply with any of the data that is existing using a CRDT, and then it will cache the result. And this means that the next time a browser asks for that data, the reply is instant because we're working with local data, even when your browser is offline. Now, the data is replicated to each browser that asks for it. So if your server fails, you can still recover the data from the other browsers. And this is important because it makes the loss of important information nearly impossible, because all of the copies of the data are stored across all of the peers within the network, meaning that the data would need to be destroyed from all of these connected clients before it is lost. Now, that's a quick overview, and with that being said, let's go ahead and start creating our application. And we're going to be building both a server application as well as a client application, and then we're going to be testing it out. Shouldn't take very long, so let's go ahead and start writing some code. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make a new directory. I'll call this Gun app. And this directory is going to hold both our front-end application as well as our server. So for our server, we're going to need a couple of dependencies. So I'm going to say npm inits to go ahead and create a package.json. And we have our package.json, and what we want to install is Express and Gun. Okay, so we have that, and I'm going to go ahead and create index.js, and this is going to be our server. So I'll go ahead and open this up in a text editor. So the server, in our case, is going to be really simple. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to be working with only like 11 lines of code. So we're going to first import Express. We're going to then import Gun. We're going to create a new Express app. We're going to set the port to 3030. And then we're going to use the Gun serve middleware. We're going to say app.use gun.serve. We then create our server. And then we initialize an instance of Gun, passing in the server that we'd like to use. And that's really about it. Once we are ready to use this, we can just run node index.js. And we now have our Gun server working. And this is going to be the peer that we're going to be working with. Or kind of the data layer that we're going to be working with. And this is going to be running on port 3030. So now that we've created the server, we're going to go ahead and create a new React app. All right, so once our React app has been created, we will go ahead and change into that directory. And what we want to do is install Gun here as well, using either npm or yarn. And while that's installing, we'll go ahead and open up our app.js. And here we can go ahead and just clear everything out, and we can start writing some code. So the first thing that we're going to need is our imports. So we're going to be importing the use effect, use state, and use reducer hooks from React. And we're going to be importing Gun from Gun. Now, the reason we're using use reducer is that we're basically going to be setting up a listener. And when we have that essentially going to be a closure, a stale closure, and we need to be able to manage our state outside of the initial setting up of use state. Now, there's a couple of ways you can handle that. Some are more complicated than others for these types of events where you're kind of listening for data and you're updating some state. In my experience, I think use reducer is the simplest way to do that. So that's the way that we're going to that's the approach that we're going to take. Next, we're going to go ahead and initialize Gun, and we're going to pass in an array of peers. This could be a single argument. You can just pass in the single peer, or if you have multiple peers, you can pass in an array. Now, we set our we set our main network to be running on localhost 3030, so that's kind of where we're going to be starting off with our Gun instance with that one peer. We next are going to create some initial state for holding our array of messages. So here we have an initial state variable with a messages array. This is going to be managed by the reducer. Next, we actually create our reducer. There's a couple of ways to deal with a reducer. A lot of times you'll have an action coming in as a second argument, but in our case, since we only have one type of state that we're working with, messages, I know that the only thing I'm going to be listening for is a message, so I'm going to make this a little more simple, and we're going to pass in the message as the action, or the second argument to the reducer, I would say. And then whenever we are calling this reducer, we know that we're going to be getting a message. So we always know we can just return the existing array of messages and then add a new message. So this is basically going to be like, okay, I want to add a new message when a new message comes through into the network, and we're going to then append, or we're actually going to add additional array item in front of our array, or at the beginning of our array. So now we can go ahead and create our app. And we're going to be working with a couple of pieces of state. So the first piece of state that we're going to be working with is our form state, and we're also going to be working with our messages state. But the form state is just going to be an object that holds the name of the person sending the message and the message itself. And then when we have someone typing into a form field, we can now update that state as they type in their name or their message. Of course, if you had some type of authentication, you might take this name off of, a signed-in user or something. But in our case, a simple example, we're just going to allow them to type the name into the form. And then we're basically going to set the form state by returning the existing form state and then passing in a key value pair, which would be something like the name and the value, or the message and the value. The next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and use the reducer in our initial state to create a variable called state. And then this is basically going to be state.messages, which is going to be the only object that's available in our state. So our state object is basically, looks like this right here. And then we have the dispatch function, which allows us to dispatch updates to our reducer. Now, we're going to have a useEffect hook. I guess I'll put this up here. UseEffect is going to first now be calling the first Gun method that we've worked with so far. So when you're working with Gun, you kind of have this key value pair idea. So if there is a key called messages, then this call right here will get that. If there isn't, then nothing will come through. And this is going to be a way for us to kind of get the messages array or the message data from the network, whether it is from our local storage or if it's from another peer. And then we're going to basically call messages.map, which is going to iterate over every item in the array. And then we're using the .on method. Now the .on method is going to basically be a listener. Well, first of all, it's going to fetch the messages, and then it's going to set up a listener. And then anytime a new message comes through, this will be invoked, and then it will be passed the new message. And then we can call dispatch, and then we're basically going to update our local state with the message. And the message is going to have a name, it's going to have an actual message, and it's going to have a created at value. So useEffect is going to trigger when the component loads. We're going to get the messages, we're going to update the local state, and then we're also creating that listener. So when any new messages come through, we go ahead and update the state. The next method that we're going to have is a way to save a message. So we are fetching the messages, and we have all of the the code set up for us to save messages, but we don't have the actual save message function. So we need to do two things. First of all, we want to set the local state, and then also we want to trigger an update to the other peers. And the way that we need to do that is all we actually have to do is set the update or call the update to Gun. And since we have that listener already set up, we're going to be able to update our local state already from that useEffect hook. So when we call messages.set, we're also going to be triggering this listener here, which is going to update our local state. And then we're going to just reset the form state because we're going to be controlling our input. So once a new message is created, we're going to just reset the form to kind of clear it out. And then the last thing we want to do is just create our UI or our user interface. And this is a really basic form where we basically have an input to hold the name. We have an input to hold the message. We have an on-click handler attached to a button that allows the user to save the message. And then we're going to map over the messages array. So if there are any messages, we're going to map over them. And then we're just going to return the values from the message, which is going to be the message itself, the sender, and the time or date that it was created at. So we kind of wrote all of the code that we're going to need for this app in about 80 lines on the client and about 11 lines on the server. So you could say about a total of less than 90 lines of code. And now we're ready to test this thing out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here, and we're going to kind of open up two tabs because we're going to need to run the server as well as the client. So the first thing I'll do is I'll run node index.js. And now we see that we have our app running on localhost 3030. And then I'm going to say npm start. All right, so our app is running. So we should be able to go ahead and create a message. Okay, that's cool. So let's now see if the peer-to-peer or the real-time is working across different browser tabs. So I want to go ahead and create open a new tab and go to localhost 3030, actually localhost 3000, and I will say all right, so it's working from both windows. Another few small things. If you don't, you can actually set where you would like the data to be stored, like whatever persistence layer you would like. You can do that by passing in an argument here. You can also set up like a local location, or you can set up a place like Amazon S3 or a few other APIs that they have available for persistence. But what it's going to do if you don't set anything up locally here, or you don't define anything, it's going to actually store the data locally. So here we have this RA data that kind of has essentially whatever data that has been stored. And then also if we crack open our local storage, we should see that we have our data saved there as well. Now, I guess the only other thing we haven't really looked at so far is like the gun documentation. So if you want to kind of learn more about this, the documentation is available at gun.eco. And I would say check out the guides for these sections to kind of get a little bit more in-depth idea of how to use Gun.js in different environments. But the real probably most useful documentation is going to be the Gun API. So I would look at the core API, and then I would look at the main API. Those are going to be the two areas where you're kind of probably going to learn the most. The Gun API is using some of the methods that we worked with, gun.put, and there's also gun.get, and there's also gun.set is something that we used a moment ago, and then gun.map. And then also I wrote a tutorial. Let's see here. On Hashnode that kind of walks through how to use Gun as well. So if you want to kind of recreate this, you could check this out. And then finally, I have the code for this app located on my GitHub repo, and I'm going to link to that within the comments of this video here. So you can kind of walk through these steps to launch this pretty easily. And that's it. I hope you learned a little something. Let me know what you think about Gun. Let me know what you think about this tutorial in the comments. And if you're not already, definitely consider subscribing to my channel, and I will see you next time.